Sarah Martinez had always been different from the other recruits at Fort Benning. Standing barely 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing just 110 pounds, she looked more like someone's younger sister than a soldier preparing for deployment. The other trainees towered over her during formations, their broad shoulders casting shadows that seemed to swallow her petite frame whole. During the first week of advanced combat training, the whispers started. Sarah would catch fragments of conversations as she passed groups of her fellow soldiers. "How did she even pass basic?" one would mutter. "She's going to get someone killed out there," another would add with a shake of his head. The comments stung, but Sarah kept her chin up and her mouth shut. She had learned long ago that actions spoke louder than words. The physical training sessions were particularly brutal. While her male counterparts could easily hoist the heavy equipment bags over their shoulders, Sarah struggled with the weight. During rope climbing exercises, her small hands would slip on the thick cables, sending her sliding back down while others scrambled up with ease. The obstacle courses seemed designed for people twice her size, and she often found herself taking alternative routes that earned her disapproving looks from the drill instructors. Captain Reynolds, their commanding officer, seemed especially skeptical of Sarah's abilities. During weapons training, he would stand behind her with his arms crossed, watching as she handled the M4 rifle that looked disproportionately large in her small hands. "Martinez," he would say in his gravelly voice, "in combat, your size won't matter to the enemy. They won't go easy on you because you're small." His words carried an undertone that suggested he doubted she belonged there at all. The other soldiers weren't cruel exactly, but they weren't welcoming either. During mess hall meals, conversations would quiet when she approached tables. Her bunkmates were polite but distant, as if they were afraid that associating with her might somehow reflect poorly on their own capabilities. Sarah found herself eating alone more often than not, using the time to study field manuals and tactical procedures. What her fellow soldiers didn't know was that Sarah had grown up on a ranch in Texas, where physical strength came in many forms. Her grandfather had taught her that leverage and technique could often overcome raw power. She had spent her childhood moving hay bales, wrestling calves, and fixing machinery alongside men twice her size. Her small stature had actually been an advantage in tight spaces, whether she was crawling under tractors or climbing into grain silos to clear blockages. But the military environment was different. Here, everything seemed to be about appearances and first impressions. Sarah's quiet confidence was mistaken for weakness, and her preference for listening rather than boasting was seen as a lack of leadership potential. She began to wonder if she had made a mistake by enlisting, if perhaps everyone else was right about her not belonging in this world of giants. The breaking point came during a particularly challenging training exercise. The unit was practicing battlefield casualty evacuation, and Sarah was paired with Jackson, a 6-foot-tall soldier from Minnesota who made no effort to hide his skepticism about her abilities. When it came time for her to drag him to safety during the simulation, he lay there like dead weight, making no effort to help. The other soldiers watched as Sarah struggled to move him even a few feet, their expressions ranging from pity to embarrassment. "This is ridiculous," Jackson muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "In a real situation, we'd both be dead." The comment drew chuckles from some of the other trainees, and Sarah felt her face burn with humiliation. She wanted to explain that he wasn't following the proper procedure for an injured soldier, that he was making the exercise unnecessarily difficult, but she knew it would sound like making excuses. That night, alone in her bunk, Sarah questioned everything. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was too small, too weak, too different to be effective in combat. The thought of quitting crossed her mind for the first time since she had enlisted. She could go home to Texas, help run the ranch, and live a normal life without constantly having to prove herself. But as she lay there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of her fellow soldiers sleeping around her, Sarah remembered why she had joined the military in the first place. It wasn't about proving she was as strong as the men around her. It was about serving her country and protecting the people she cared about. Size and strength came in many forms, and she was determined to find her place in this world, regardless of what others thought. The deployment to Afghanistan came sooner than expected. Sarah's unit was assigned to Forward Operating Base Chapman, a remote outpost nestled in the mountains where the air was thin and the terrain unforgiving. The base served as a crucial supply point for smaller patrol bases scattered throughout the region, and Sarah found herself assigned to convoy security duty. Her squad leader, Sergeant Davis, was a career soldier with 15 years of experience and a reputation for not suffering fools. When he first met Sarah, his expression was unreadable, but she could sense his reservations. "Martinez," he said, during their first briefing, "I don't care how big or small you are. Out here, everyone pulls their weight or people die. You understand me?" Sarah nodded, grateful that at least he seemed willing to give her a chance to prove herself. The first few weeks at the FOB were relatively quiet, filled with routine patrols and supply runs. Sarah threw herself into learning everything she could about the local area, studying maps until she could navigate the winding mountain roads blindfolded. She volunteered for extra duties, whether it was helping in the communications tent or assisting the medics with equipment maintenance. Slowly, some of her squad mates began to warm up to her work ethic, if not her presence. Private Collins, a young soldier from Ohio who was on his first deployment, seemed particularly nervous about having Sarah as part of their team. During their first patrol together, he kept glancing at her with worried expressions as if expecting her to collapse under the weight of her gear at any moment. "You sure you can keep up?" he asked as they prepared to leave the wire. Sarah simply adjusted her pack straps and checked her weapon one more time. "I'll be fine," she replied quietly. The patrol routes took them through some of the most dangerous territory in the region. The roads were little more than dirt tracks carved into cliff sides, with drops of hundreds of feet on one side and sheer rock walls on the other. Taliban fighters were known to set up ambushes in the countless caves and crevices that dotted the mountainsides, and improvised explosive devices were a constant threat. During one particularly tense mission, their convoy had to navigate a series of switchbacks that climbed up a mountain pass. Sarah was riding in the second vehicle, manning the radio and keeping watch for potential threats. The landscape was breathtakingly beautiful and terrifyingly dangerous at the same time. Ancient valleys stretched out below them, dotted with small villages where life continued much as it had for centuries. As they rounded a sharp curve, the lead vehicle suddenly stopped. Through her headset, Sarah heard the driver's voice, tight with tension. "Possible IED ahead. Everyone stay alert." The convoy went into defensive positions while the explosive ordnance disposal team moved forward to investigate. Sarah found herself pressed against the rocky mountainside, her rifle ready, scanning the ridgelines for any sign of enemy movement. The waiting was always the worst part. In those moments of heightened alert, every shadow could hide a sniper, every distant sound could be the prelude to an attack. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, but her hands remained steady on her weapon. She had trained for this moment countless times, but the reality of being in a potential combat situation was entirely different from any simulation. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the EOD team gave the all-clear. The suspicious object turned out to be debris from a rockslide, not an explosive device. The convoy resumed its journey, but the incident served as a stark reminder of how quickly things could go wrong in this environment. Back at the FOB that evening, Sarah sat in the communications tent writing in her journal. She had started keeping a record of their missions, partly as a way to process the stress and partly because she wanted to remember every detail of this experience. As she wrote, Sergeant Davis appeared in the doorway. "Martinez," he said, settling into a chair across from her. "I wanted to talk to you about today." Sarah's stomach tightened, expecting criticism or concerns about her performance. Instead, Davis surprised her. "You kept your head out there, stayed calm under pressure. That's not something you can teach." He paused, studying her face in the dim light of the tent. "Some of the guys are still getting used to having you around, but I want you to know that you're holding your own." The words meant more to Sarah than any medal or commendation could have. For the first time since arriving in Afghanistan, she felt like she might actually belong here. But she also knew that the real test was still to come. The Taliban had been unusually quiet lately, and everyone at the FOB could feel the tension building. Intelligence reports suggested that a major offensive was being planned, and it was only a matter of time before their remote outpost found itself in the crosshairs. As she finished her journal entry and prepared for bed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The mountains around them held secrets and dangers that she couldn't yet imagine, and somewhere out there in the darkness, forces were moving that would soon put all of their training and courage to the ultimate test. The attack came at dawn on a Tuesday morning, just as the base was beginning to stir with the routine activities of another day. Sarah was in the mess tent, finishing her coffee and going over the day's patrol schedule with Sergeant Davis, when the first mortar round exploded just outside the perimeter. The force of the blast knocked over tables and sent soldiers scrambling for their weapons and protective gear. "Incoming! Take cover!" Davis shouted as more explosions rocked the base. Sarah grabbed her helmet and body armor, her training taking over as adrenaline flooded her system. The attack was coming from multiple directions, with mortar fire raining down from the surrounding mountains while small arms fire erupted from concealed positions in the nearby ridgelines. The Taliban had clearly been planning this assault for weeks, if not months. They had positioned fighters in caves and behind rock formations that provided excellent cover, while giving them clear lines of sight into the base. The morning mist that often settled in the valley worked to their advantage, making it difficult for the defenders to pinpoint the exact locations of the enemy positions. Sarah ran toward her assigned defensive position, dodging debris and keeping low as bullets whistled overhead. The base's alarm system was blaring, adding to the chaos and confusion. She could see other soldiers taking cover behind concrete barriers and in reinforced bunkers, returning fire toward the mountain slopes where muzzle flashes revealed enemy positions. From her position behind a sandbagged wall, Sarah began engaging targets with her M4 rifle. The scope allowed her to pick out individual enemy fighters among the rocks, and her ranch-raised marksmanship skills served her well. Each shot was deliberate and carefully aimed, conserving ammunition while maximizing effectiveness. Around her, other soldiers were laying down suppressive fire, their weapons chattering on full automatic. The battle raged for over an hour, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The Taliban fighters were well entrenched and had the high ground, but the American forces had superior firepower and training. Helicopter gunships arrived to provide close air support, their rockets and machine guns raking the enemy positions. But the fighters simply melted back into the caves and crevices, only to reappear moments later. During a brief lull in the fighting, Sergeant Davis made his way over to Sarah's position. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat, and she could see the strain of command weighing on him. "Martinez, I need you to help coordinate the medical evacuation," he said, pointing toward the aid station where wounded soldiers were being treated. "We've got multiple casualties, and the medics need someone with radio experience to guide the helicopter in." Sarah nodded and began making her way toward the medical area, staying low and using whatever cover was available. The sight that greeted her there was sobering. Several soldiers lay on stretchers, their injuries ranging from shrapnel wounds to more serious trauma. The medics were working frantically to stabilize the wounded before the evacuation helicopter arrived. Among the casualties was Jackson, the same soldier who had questioned her abilities during training. He had taken shrapnel to his leg and was conscious but in obvious pain. When he saw Sarah, his expression was complex, a mixture of surprise and something that might have been embarrassment. "Hey, Martinez," he said through gritted teeth. "Guess you're stuck with all of us after all." The medical evacuation helicopter arrived 20 minutes later, its rotors whipping up clouds of dust and debris. Sarah helped the medics load the wounded onto stretchers and carry them to the landing zone. The aircraft could only stay on the ground for a few minutes due to the ongoing enemy fire, so everything had to be done quickly and efficiently. As the helicopter lifted off with the wounded aboard, another explosion rocked the base. This one was closer than the others, and Sarah could feel the shock wave in her chest. The Taliban fighters were adjusting their fire, walking their mortar rounds closer to the main defensive positions. It was clear that this wasn't just a hit-and-run attack. The enemy was committed to overrunning the base. Word came over the radio that a patrol that had been outside the wire when the attack started was now cut off and under heavy fire. They were pinned down in a rocky outcropping about 2 miles from the base, unable to move due to the intensity of the enemy fire. Their position was precarious and ammunition was running low. Sergeant Davis gathered a relief force to break through to the trapped patrol. Sarah volunteered immediately, despite the obvious dangers involved. The mission would require them to leave the relative safety of the base and move through terrain that was almost certainly occupied by enemy fighters. It was the kind of operation that tested every aspect of their training and courage. As they prepared to leave the wire, Sarah checked her equipment one final time. Her weapon was clean and fully loaded, her radio was functioning properly, and her medical kit was complete. She looked around at the faces of her squad mates, seeing the same mixture of fear and determination that she felt herself. In a few minutes, they would be moving through some of the most dangerous terrain imaginable, with lives depending on their success. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same soldiers who had once questioned her presence were now counting on her to help rescue their trapped comrades. But there was no time for reflection on past slights or vindication. People were in danger, and that was all that mattered. The relief force moved out under covering fire from the base's remaining defenders. Sarah was part of a 12-man team led by Sergeant Davis, their mission to reach the pinned-down patrol and extract them before the Taliban could overrun their position. The route would take them through a narrow valley filled with boulders and rocky outcroppings that provided perfect ambush sites for enemy fighters. Moving in tactical formation, the team advanced carefully through the treacherous terrain. Sarah found herself in the middle of the column, her small size actually becoming an advantage as she could move quickly between rocks and take cover in spaces that larger soldiers couldn't use. Her radio crackled with updates from both the trapped patrol and the base, painting a picture of an increasingly desperate situation. The trapped soldiers were running low on ammunition and had several wounded among their number. Their position on a rocky ledge provided some protection, but they were completely exposed to fire from the heights above them. Taliban fighters had surrounded them on 3 sides, and it was only a matter of time before they would be forced to surrender or be overrun. As the relief force moved deeper into the valley, they began taking sporadic sniper fire from the ridgelines above. The shots echoed off the canyon walls, making it difficult to determine exactly where they were coming from. Sarah pressed herself against a boulder as bullets chipped rock just inches from her head, the sound of ricochets filling the air around them. Sergeant Davis called for the team to take cover while he tried to locate the sniper positions. Through her rifle scope, Sarah scanned the maze of caves and rock formations above them, looking for any sign of movement or muzzle flash. The enemy fighters were well concealed, using the natural features of the landscape to their advantage. A burst of automatic weapon fire erupted from their left flank, catching the relief force in a crossfire. The Taliban had positioned a machine gun team in a cluster of boulders, and their field of fire covered the entire width of the valley. Sarah could see the muzzle flashes as the weapon chattered, spraying bullets across their position and forcing everyone to seek whatever cover they could find. Private Collins, who had been moving just ahead of Sarah, suddenly cried out and went down hard. She could see blood spreading across his uniform as he tried to crawl behind a rock for cover. The machine gun continued firing, keeping the rest of the team pinned down while Collins lay exposed in the open, unable to move further. "I can't reach him," shouted Corporal Williams, the team medic, from his position behind a nearby boulder. "That machine gun has the whole area covered. Anyone who tries to get to Collins is going to get cut down." The situation was desperate. Collins was losing blood and needed immediate medical attention, but reaching him seemed impossible under the circumstances. Sarah studied the terrain, using her knowledge of the landscape to look for an alternative approach. Growing up on the ranch had taught her to see possibilities that others might miss, to find paths through seemingly impossible obstacles. She noticed a shallow depression in the ground that ran parallel to the machine gun position, offering potential concealment if someone stayed low enough. "I can get to him," she told Sergeant Davis over the radio. "There's a low route along the left side. I'm small enough to stay below their line of sight." Davis immediately rejected the idea, but Sarah was already moving, using the depression to crawl toward Collins's position while staying below the level of the surrounding rocks. The machine gun continued firing, but the bullets were passing over her head as she belly crawled through the narrow channel. Loose rocks cut through her uniform and into her knees and elbows, but she ignored the pain and kept moving. Behind her, she could hear Davis cursing over the radio, but he was also directing the rest of the team to provide covering fire. When she reached Collins, she could see that he had taken a bullet through his thigh just above the knee. The wound was bleeding heavily and his face was pale with shock. "Sarah," he whispered, his eyes wide with surprise and pain. "What are you doing here? You're going to get yourself killed." She ignored his protests and began working on his wound, applying pressure and preparing a field dressing. "We're getting you out of here," she told him, her voice calm despite the bullet still flying overhead. "I need you to help me as much as you can. When I say move, you move. Understand?" Collins nodded weakly, trusting her completely even though, just weeks before, he had questioned her ability to keep up with the team. Getting Collins back to safety was going to be the most challenging part. He was nearly twice her weight, and only semi-conscious from blood loss and shock. The depression she had used to reach him was too narrow for two people, which meant they would have to find another way back to the team's position. Sarah keyed her radio and called for covering fire, then began dragging Collins toward a cluster of rocks that offered better protection. The machine gun swung toward them, its bullets striking the ground just feet away, but the covering fire from her teammates forced the enemy gunner to duck for cover long enough for them to reach safety. Once they were behind the rocks, Sarah was able to properly assess Collins' injuries and apply a tourniquet to stop the bleeding. She could hear Davis calling her name over the radio, his voice tight with concern and anger. The relief mission was turning into a rescue mission, and they still hadn't reached the original patrol that was trapped further up the valley. Time was running out for everyone involved. With Collins stabilized and the immediate threat from the machine gun neutralized by concentrated fire from the relief force, Sarah faced her greatest challenge yet. The wounded soldier was drifting in and out of consciousness, his body going into shock from blood loss despite her field treatment. At nearly 400 pounds of dead weight, including his gear and equipment, Collins represented an impossible burden for someone of Sarah's size under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. The Taliban fighters were regrouping, and intelligence reports over the radio indicated that enemy reinforcements were moving toward their position. The original trapped patrol was still pinned down and running critically low on ammunition. Every known minute that passed decreased their chances of getting everyone out alive. "Martinez, we need to move now," Sergeant Davis called over the radio. "Can you get Collins mobile?" Sarah looked down at the semi-conscious soldier, calculating distances and options. The nearest safe position was over 200 yards away, across on terrain that offered minimal cover from enemy fire. Carrying Collins that distance would require strength and endurance that everyone, including herself, doubted she possessed. "I've got him, Sergeant," she replied, her voice steady despite the enormity of the task ahead. She began stripping away Collins's non-essential gear, keeping only his weapon, ammunition, and critical equipment. Every pound removed would make the journey marginally easier, though the soldier himself still represented a massive physical challenge. Drawing on techniques she had learned growing up on the ranch, Sarah positioned herself to maximize leverage and distribute weight efficiently. Her grandfather had always said that smart work could overcome strong work, and she had spent years moving objects much heavier than herself by using proper technique and mechanical advantage. She got Collins into a modified fireman's carry, using his own equipment straps to help secure him to her back and shoulders. The initial lift nearly buckled her knees, but she found her balance and took the first step, then another. The weight was crushing, and she could feel her legs trembling with the effort, but she began moving toward the rally point where the rest of the team was waiting. The first 100 yards were the hardest. Sarah's muscles screamed in protest and sweat poured down her face despite the cool mountain air. Collins murmured incoherently, sometimes trying to help by pushing with his good leg, other times going completely limp. Behind them, she could hear sporadic gunfire as Taliban fighters probed their former position. Halfway to the rally point, Sarah stumbled and nearly went down. The rocky terrain made each step treacherous, and the added weight of Collins made it almost impossible to maintain balance. For a moment, she considered calling for help, admitting that the task was beyond her capabilities, but she could see the amazed faces of her teammates ahead, and she knew that this moment would define not just her own future in the unit, but potentially save Colin's life. "Come on, Martinez," she whispered to herself, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. "You've got this." She adjusted her grip, found better footing, and continued forward. Each step was a victory, each breath a triumph over the crushing weight and burning muscles. The other team members watched in stunned silence as this tiny soldier carried their wounded comrade across impossible terrain. Corporal Williams, the medic, ran forward to help with the final few yards, but Sarah waved him off. She had come this far. She would finish the job herself. When she finally reached the rally point and gently lowered Collins to the ground, the silence was deafening. Collins opened his eyes and looked up at her, his face pale but grateful. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry for everything I said before. You just saved my life." Around them, the other soldiers stared with expressions that ranged from disbelief to newfound respect. Sergeant Davis shook his head slowly as if trying to process what he had just witnessed. But there was no time for reflection. The radio crackled with urgent messages from the trapped patrol. They were down to their last magazines of ammunition, and Taliban fighters were massing for what appeared to be a final assault. The relief force had to continue their mission, even though they now had a seriously wounded soldier to protect and evacuate. Sarah helped load Collins onto an improvised stretcher, knowing that the hardest part of their mission still lay ahead. The trapped patrol was another half-mile through enemy-held territory, and the Taliban were clearly aware of their presence. The element of surprise was gone, replaced by a desperate race against time and overwhelming odds. As the team prepared to move out again, Sarah checked her weapons and equipment one final time. Her body ached from the tremendous effort of carrying Collins, and she could feel exhaustion creeping into her muscles. But she had proven something important today, not just to her teammates but to herself. Size and strength came in many forms, and determination could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. The other soldiers looked at her differently now, their expressions reflecting a new understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. Sergeant Davis approached her as they prepared to continue the mission. "Martinez," he said quietly, "that was the most incredible thing I've ever seen a soldier do. Collins owes you his life." Sarah simply nodded and shouldered her weapon. The mission wasn't over yet, and people were still counting on them to bring them home safely. The rescue of the trapped patrol became a textbook example of small unit tactics, with Sarah playing a crucial role in the operation's success. Her actions in carrying Collins had transformed the team's dynamic completely. Soldiers who had once questioned her presence now looked to her for guidance, recognizing that courage and capability came in forms they hadn't expected. The final push to reach the pinned-down patrol required the team to navigate through a narrow canyon where Taliban fighters had established multiple ambush positions. Sarah's small size allowed her to scout ahead, identifying enemy positions and finding routes that kept the team out of direct fire. Her radio calls guided helicopter gunships to precise targets, helping to suppress enemy fire long enough for the relief force to advance. When they finally reached the trapped soldiers, they found a desperate situation. 3 men were wounded, ammunition was nearly exhausted, and Taliban fighters were preparing for a final assault from multiple directions. The patrol leader, a seasoned sergeant named Morrison, greeted the relief force with obvious relief, but his expression changed to surprise when he saw Sarah among the rescuers. "Martinez," he said, recognition dawning on his face. "You're the soldier everyone's been talking about back at base, the one who carried Collins out under fire." Word of her actions had already spread through the military communications network, reaching even this isolated position. Sarah felt embarrassed by the attention, but focused on the tactical situation at hand. The extraction required careful coordination between air support, the relief force, and the trapped patrol. Sarah found herself naturally taking charge of communications, her calm voice and clear thinking helping to coordinate the complex operation. The soldiers around her, both from the relief force and the trapped patrol, followed her lead without question, their earlier doubts completely forgotten. During the withdrawal, Taliban fighters launched one final desperate attack, trying to prevent the Americans from escaping with their wounded. Sarah found herself in the rear guard, helping to carry one of the injured soldiers while simultaneously directing suppressive fire against pursuing enemies. Her rifle work was precise and effective, each shot carefully placed to maximum effect. The journey back to base took over 3 hours, with the team moving carefully through terrain that offered countless opportunities for ambush. Sarah rotated between carrying wounded soldiers, maintaining radio communications, and providing covering fire when needed. Her endurance seemed limitless, powered by adrenaline and an unshakable determination to bring everyone home safely. When they finally reached the base perimeter, cheers erupted from the defenders who had been monitoring their progress over the radio. The entire garrison had heard about Sarah's heroic rescue of Collins, and many had gathered to witness the return of the relief force. As they passed through the gates, soldiers who had never spoken to Sarah before called out encouragement and congratulations. In the weeks that followed, Sarah's actions became legendary throughout the region. Stories of the tiny soldier who carried a 400-pound man to safety spread from base to base, growing in the telling but always maintaining the essential truth of her extraordinary courage and strength. Military reporters arrived to document her story, and senior officers flew in specifically to meet her. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from her fellow soldiers. Collins, recovering from his wounds, sought her out to express his gratitude properly. "You saved my life," he said simply, "and you showed all of us what real strength looks like." The other soldiers who had once doubted her now competed for the privilege of serving alongside her, recognizing that they were in the presence of someone truly special. Sergeant Davis recommended Sarah for the Silver Star, the nation's third highest decoration for valor in combat. The citation would read in part, "Private Martinez's extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty reflect great credit upon herself, her unit, and the United States Army." But for Sarah, the real reward was the knowledge that she had proven herself when it mattered most. The base never forgot what happened that day in the mountains. Sarah's actions had saved multiple lives and demonstrated that heroism comes in all sizes. She had faced down doubt, prejudice, and seemingly impossible odds to emerge as one of the most respected soldiers in the entire theater of operations. The girl from Texas who had once been dismissed because of her size had become a legend, proving that true strength comes from within and that courage knows no physical boundaries. Years later, when Sarah returned home to Texas, she would carry with her the satisfaction of knowing that she had answered every question about her capabilities in the most definitive way possible. She had not just survived in a world of giants, she had excelled, leading by example and earning the respect and admiration of everyone who served alongside her. The ranch that had taught her about leverage and determination had prepared her well for challenges that few could have imagined, and she had risen to meet them with grace, courage, and unshakable determination.